Need to create a complex enterprise Angular application? Angular Bootcamp is an intensive 3-day workshop class to learn the basics of Angular through sophisticated techniques for real-world applications. We target Angular 6 and the recent versions, with much of the curriculum is suitable back to Angular 2. Or go beyond the 3-day class with a consultation or project launch with Oasis Digital, the team behind Angular Bootcamp. We can assist your team or launch your project with advanced Angular topics including scalability, data flow, state management, full stack product design, and more. Contact us for a private class at your location or buy a ticket for public classes in various cities around the US and occasionally in Europe. Online live instructor training is also available at angularbootcamp.com. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adventures in Angular. This week on our panel we have Alyssa Nicoll.
Hello, hello. Glad to be here, everyone.
John Papa.
Hello.
Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. If you listened to last week, you heard all about the new show coming out about freedom, developer freedom, so go check it out, thedevrev.com. And this week we have a special guest, and that is Mike Giambalvo. Did I say that right?
It's Giambalvo.
Giambalvo. Awesome. Do you want to give us a brief intro? Tell us why you're famous.
Sure, yeah. So I'm one of the contributing authors for Testing Angular Applications, a new book out from Manning about testing best practices for Angular. It has 4 contributors. Craig Nishina and myself are both on the Protractor team. So we contributed chapters on Protractor and end-to-end testing specifically. And the other authors in the book are Jesse Palmer and Karina Cohn.
Nice. So I've been writing a book, but I've been doing it by myself. What's it like writing a book with contributors, collaborators?
Yeah, I was going to ask, was that hard being like one of 4 people?
It was hard, and we're all in separate areas, right? Mm-hmm. So we couldn't actually meet in person. So the story about that, what happened is back in the Angular 2.0 days, Jesse was writing a book about testing Angular applications that was focused specifically on Angular 2. And he was also making it kind of an introduction to Angular 2 of like, hey, here's what components are and this new thing, right? And here's TypeScript. And it was going kind of slow.
What was that first thing you said? Component?
Yeah, components. They're called components. Yeah.
We'll get to that later, maybe.
So
circle back around.
So he was working with Manning on writing this book. And at the time, Craig and I were working on Protractor. Craig is awesome about going into the community and like making connections with people. So he met Jesse, made friends. And Jesse was like, hey, I'm doing this book. I could really use some help just finishing it, getting it over the line. And so Craig asked me to jump in, and Jesse found Karina, and we all like got together and got this thing finished. And it wasn't that difficult because we had areas we specialized in, so we could break it down. So Craig and I took the end-to-end testing chapters. Jesse continued with sort of the front half of the book. Karina jumped in on middle chapters about specifically testing services and some testing of routers too.
Okay, so if you break it up by section of book, I guess that makes it easier. I was imagining like writing a chapter together with someone or something, and feeling like that would be hard.
And Craig and I did work together on some chapters, and that's sort of easier because we worked together, so we could just like share a Google Doc.
Yeah, I was going to say,
like one of those games, like choose your own adventures, guys. We could just sit and rotate around the room and just pick different words. Like,
it was like finish the sentence improv game.
Yeah, I was thinking something more like you write the first half of every sentence, and somebody else writes the last half of every sentence. Like that would be the way I would probably
imagining merge conflicts on paragraphs and going.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was imagining. I was imagining it was like writing code, but like with text. And
it kind of was in a bit. So this was also the experience of writing a book was kind of like that because you're in Word. So you've got these big Word documents that you go through, you write your chapters, and then you send them off to the publisher, and then someone edits them and like comes up with basically code comments that you have to then come in and edit. And it's all like lots of different. It was not a very fun process in terms of like dealing with merge conflicts and dealing with versions.
How many back and forths do you have? Like, I want to get to the content of it, but I also am super interested about this. Like on the editing, pass it back, editing again, pass it back. What would you say? Like 10, 5, 2?
It depends. I don't know exactly, but I'd say around 8 back and forth. And one of the problems with us is because we had 4 different authors, they have to do what's called a one voice pass, where they pick someone to go through and edit the book and put everything into like just their voice, just so it's not like you're like switching around styles as you read.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was wondering because a lot of times when I'm reading a co-authored book, I'm always impressed with how I can't necessarily tell that from one chapter to the next, it was written by somebody else. So that's intentional. I see.
Yeah, there's a specific editing pass.
Okay.
So there's grammar and style editing passes, and then there's a technical review phase. It's very waterfall. It's very like, we'll do this phase, and I'll do this phase, and I'll do this phase. And I was amazed at how kind of slow the process was. We had a big rush to get like our chapters done at the beginning of the year, and then it's just coming out now, like 8 or 9 months later.
I see. So you feel like the editing process was the main holdup, not the writing?
Yeah, definitely.
So my former co-hosts on Ruby Rogues, I have no regrets. We were going to co-write a book, all 6 of us. And now I feel a lot better about not having ever. Oh, what's kind of the core, like if you can break down the book into like 3 or 4 core ideas, what do you hit people with as far as here's what you got to know? Like if we could just get an elevator pitch on it.
And and what is the starting knowledge? Like, do you come in we expect you to know testing already, or?
No, the starting knowledge is we expect you to have maybe done the Angular intro, I'd say. And that's about it. The book has a sample application, sort of a contacts app. And it sort of walks you through setting up that app, writing tests for it. Yeah, and step by step starts with specific examples of testing components, testing services that work together, dealing with asynchronicity, and then goes into end-to-end testing.
So are there specific principles that you put out there as far as when you write your tests, make sure you're thinking about these things or doing these things or taking this kind of an approach?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the testing pyramid in the book, like just in general, having more unit tests necessarily than end-to-end tests. Starting with, I think part of what we highlight is the advantage that comes with Angular compared to Angular.js in that you can test the rendering of your component as well, right? So you can test out your template. You can test like, when I change this, does this show up here? So that shows up in the book a lot. We also talk a bit about testing asynchronous behavior using the async zone or the fake async zone, and sort of the differences between the two. And yeah, so the importance of making your tests deterministic. It's very example driven, I'd say.
Nice. One thing that I want to kind of hit on here, because you mentioned the testing pyramid, and I feel like I've been talking about testing all week.
Right.
Because Elixir Mix, we talked about testing. Ruby Rogues, we talked about testing. Last week's React Roundup was also about testing. We had Kent C. Dodds on, and he was talking about testing in React. Some of you might know him because he used to be an Angular guy. But anyway, he was talking about it, and he was talking more about shifting more of the weight toward end-to-end tests with Cypress and things like that, because it's faster and easier to do those tests than it used to be. And so since the barrier to entry is lower, you can see that your entire app works nicely and you don't have to worry so much about testing implementation details with your unit tests.
Right.
And I'm curious, do you see this kind of shift when you talk to people about testing, or are people still using the pyramid and getting the value out of it is what I'm really worried about? Right.
Absolutely. So I would say, like, as a more pragmatic matter, like I personally am not like a huge fan of the pyramid. It's sort of a multi-author book, and that's sort of in there. But I would say in general, like the important concerns of a test are not necessarily how small a bit of code it covers. The important concerns are, does it run quickly? Is it reliable? If it fails, can you quickly identify the cause? And so to give you some background, I work on Google Cloud Platform, which is when you go to GCP, the entire thing is one giant Angular app. And so a few years ago, when they were developing GCP and building it out, they started entirely from Protractor tests. So we have this big suite of end-to-end tests that have to start up a backend server, that have to like register production accounts, go to the website, like navigate around and click on things. And a few years ago, we had a problem because we were out of VMs in a region, because one of our end-to-end tests running with every release had reserved every possible VM in Germany, right? So you can't just rely on end-to-end tests because they're going to be expensive, right, especially if you're using like production resources. So what our team has done is moved to shim backends. Like we've faked out that part of the stack, but they still have to make like an API call at some point, right? And GCP being like a very large, complex UI, it actually has to make a lot of different API calls. And so if we don't want to be testing in production, we have to be faking those out at some level. whether that's writing just a complete fake reimplementation of our backends, or whether that's doing something in the browser. So what we've tried to do, especially with the move to Angular 2 within GCP, is to focus people on taking their Protractor tests, which start a browser and connect to some kind of server of some kind, and pull that slightly back into tests that run in Karma, which we call page-level integration tests. So these are, if you look at the testing pyramid, they're maybe in the middle, right? These are tests that, they're not unit tests because they're not testing like a single function or component in isolation. They're testing an entire page at once, but they're still mocking out a lot of the common framework. A lot of the router is sort of mocked out. Any sort of service that makes a backend call, that ends up being mocked out. But we end up testing the entire page in concert. And because that's not actually starting a server, it starts very quickly. Because it's not making backend calls, it's it's what we call hermetic and repeatable. And it's easier to debug. To go back to your question, I would say that yes, I think that's true. That the balance is between, is your test entirely hermetic and that it can't fail from external causes? Or are you testing in production? Is your test fast or slow and that it's bringing in more or fewer components? And is your test testing your application end to end? And you want to be testing as far end to end as you can, I think, while still preserving hermeticity and making your tests fast, making them reliable and not using production resources.
Can we define hermeticity? Does that mean like being a hermit?
It means hermetic. So
it's from hermetic, not hermit. Okay, got it.
Helpful. Yeah, for hermetic, right?
I was like, maybe it means like being solo, like a hermit.
Yeah,
right.
It's more like it's sealed off from outside contamination.
Right, like you're in an airlock or in like in a bubble,
Okay.
By the way, after your explanation, what you did, writing the book must have been a breeze compared to that. Wow.
Yeah, well,
I mean, there's a lot there, but the value's there too, the payoff for having tests in that way and knowing, having some confidence about your code. I mean, it makes a ton of sense to go through the effort given the number of people that use GCP.
Right. Yeah. And so to go back to your original point, like I think tools like Cypress are very helpful. Cypress it's a weird end of the testing pyramid, right? Because it is not running your app sort of completely alone in isolation. It's living in the browser with your app, like in an iframe. So maybe like one level above that is WebDriver testing, where you're actually automating a browser, but you have all this other stuff you have to worry about. And so the question is,
that's how Protractor works, right?
That is how Protractor works, yeah. And I'd like to get into that a bit too, because it's a long story.
So where do you recommend people start? Let's say that I have a large legacy app that doesn't have many or any tests on it. Do you recommend they start at the high level, Protractor or Cypress type test, or do you recommend that they kind of come down to unit tests or integrations between components or things like that?
I think starting in the middle, like finding the right balance that works for you is what's most important. Like what situation can you create where it's as easy as possible to create new tests as you continue to develop features? There's a really great book, probably about 2 decades old at this point, Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Martin Fowler. And his point is that untested code is legacy code, that if you don't have tests around your code, you become afraid to change it. And if you can't change it confidently, then you can't refactor. And that's how you end up with a mess that no one wants to work on. And the way around that is to start with the outside in, make tests probably at the integration level, but again, at whatever sort of balance between hermeticity and speed and reliability that you need to find. So probably at the Cypress or at the page level integration test level, nail down behavior, have something that will fail if you break some feature you weren't aware of. So you have the confidence to come in and refactor. And then as you come in and refactor, sort of stake out ground with unit tests for things that are trickier, for things that you're more worried about. I'm not a believer in having like 100% unit test coverage. I think it's more important to have kind of broad integration test coverage for things that are likely to fail, right? And if there's a really particularly tricky bit of code in a single function or in a single component, then by all means have a unit test for that. But to the extent that you're just wiring stuff up together, it's more valuable to have an integration test.
Yeah, we've talked to Michael Feathers about working effectively with legacy code on Ruby Rogue. So I'm going to see if I can find a link for that and put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
What's your opinion of some of the other tools that have come up in recent times, Cypress and Test Café and some of these other tools like this?
So I'm not familiar with Test Café. I am somewhat familiar with Cypress, although I haven't actually tried it out yet. I've just mostly been following other people's blog posts and docs. There's kind of a long story in how all of these things fit together. If we look at browser testing 5 or 7 years ago, we were using Selenium. And Selenium was a project to make it, easy to automate web tests. And in the old days, Selenium actually did what Cypress does. Selenium would run in the browser alongside your app, simulating click events, simulating different behavior. That was the way it worked for a few years. And then they developed this alternate way of doing things called Selenium RC, Selenium Remote Control, where it would actually send commands to the browser and run in a separate process. And that was popular at the time because you could write your tests in Java or in Python or whatever and control a browser separately. Keep in mind, this was like 7 years ago. JavaScript wasn't as great as it is now back then. Selenium RC caught on. And so people created different sort of heroic implementations to make browsers remote controllable. And it depended on the browser. So in Safari, you'd have like a special extension. And in fact, for a lot of these, it was you have like a special extension or a special program that runs aside them. And as someone who did browser testing back then, like 5+ years ago, it was a pain because for every browser, you had to come up with a way to remote control it, to plug it into your tests if you wanted the same test to run on every browser. This effort turned into WebDriver, Selenium WebDriver. And what Selenium WebDriver has been doing that they just achieved in the past couple of years is pushing for this kind of automation to be a W3C browser standard. So they finally got that. It was the result of a long struggle that now browser vendors have a standard that they have to make their browsers automatable via some sort of well-defined protocol. So if you write a test using the WebDriver protocol, you can run it against Safari, you can run it against Edge, AiA kind of. Edge supports the W3C protocol better, and of course Chrome and Firefox. It was a lot of effort to get to there, and right at the point when the W3C standard was a thing is when Cypress started to become popular, because that was the point of like peak pain of having to deal with, oh, I'm on version 45 of Firefox, I need this version of the Gecko driver, or like people would have to like download these drivers separately and manage them. Keeping on top of version skew was a pain. And it was much simpler just to have something like Cypress, which worked just like Selenium did back 10 years ago, where you have your test in the browser running alongside your app in an iframe. And there's a lot of advantages to that. You can more easily mock out XHR requests. It runs faster because you're not having multiple processes you have to juggle. Like it's just in your browser. If you're a web developer, you can debug it more easily because the debugging experience in browsers is a lot better than it was 10 years ago. So I think it's a useful tool, and I think if it works for people, they should use it. But the disadvantage is you're not able to, your tests aren't quite as high fidelity as they would be using WebDriver. You're not quite testing like the browser in isolation with your app as if a user were sitting there, which is what WebDriver tries to achieve. Cypress makes a trade-off in making a test that is slightly less like a user sitting at a computer using your app in a browser. But the trade-offs they get for that loss in fidelity gives them better debuggability, gives them a faster startup time, faster test time. So that's kind of where that all sits. At the same time, there's a tool from Chrome called Puppeteer. So if we look at it, and this is going to be a great podcast because it's very visual, is you have WebDriver that is calling into something called Chrome Driver that is using the DevTools API to control Chrome. And what Puppeteer is an NPM that lets you just use the DevTools protocol at like a lower level than WebDriver. And what that means is the Chrome team can have an API that they have more control over and experiment with more and do more back and forth with the browser. That is a bit easier to use than the WebDriver protocol, which has to work for all browsers. And they also do some other great things with Puppeteer. They bundle in a Chromium, so you don't have to actually like download. You don't have to worry about which version of Chrome you have and which version of Chrome Driver you have. Like it just comes with a browser that it works with. So it just starts. So Puppeteer and Cypress are both like easier ways to do end-to-end testing.
So if it comes with Chromium, does it work in Electron as well then?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Okay. I seem to remember seeing something about having Puppeteer work with Electron. It does use the DevTools API, so I assume it at least works at some level.
Well, maybe we'll have a listener leave a comment.
Yeah.
I like that explanation. I appreciate you going through that. I used Protractor for many years on Selenium, and prior to Protractor, I used Selenium more directly, not just web, but with other platforms too, because Selenium also talks like historically with some Java apps that I've worked with or some
Right.
.NET apps and things. But I'll tell you this, what's great about Protractor was that we could CI it, if that's a verb now. We could easily put it in the CI processes. What was not so great for me was the experience of writing end-to-end tests with Protractor. To me, pales in comparison to like something like Cypress these days.
Right. Right, because it is fundamentally more complex, right? You've still got two processes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was part of the reason I wanted to write a Protractor chapter for this book, is because we'd had problems with explaining the complexity of Protractor to people. And one of those big sticking points, and it definitely was for me when I joined the project, is, you know, you've got your test running in the browser, and you've got your test running in Node, and you've got your app running in the browser, and they're communicating. Sometimes you're running JavaScript that appears in your test, but is actually being like serialized and shipped to the browser and run there. So you've got these two different runtimes, and you might need to debug your test Node.js runtime separately from your app. And it's a lot of complexity. And that was one thing I learned, like in writing this chapter, is the mental load we ask for people is pretty high if you have to actually write a whole book to explain how the whole thing works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even just getting people started, like the way the selectors work is similar. I feel it's a little easier in Cypress. What really helped me in Cypress was, as I'm coding, like you said earlier, you've got the visual browser up and running over on one side, seeing the changes happen as it goes.
Right.
It's super easy to be able to, like, you know, actually interact with it and click on elements to go, wait, it's not selecting or typing in the right box. Let me go look and see what exactly it thinks it is. So it gives you like a selector inside the tool. And I personally found using that was helpful. Although one gotcha I ran into with Cypress was they have an option to run it in Electron or to run it in Chromium. And it's significantly more stable when I'm running in Electron than running it in Chromium directly. Like, I never have to restart it. Whereas with Chrome, it was like half the time, you know, 4 or 5 runs in, I'd have to refresh. So it's not perfect.
Interesting. Yeah, I wonder why that would be.
Yeah, but again, it's not. I can't find a way to make this really CI-able, and running it only in Chrome is not good enough for me. It's got to run in multiple browsers. So
right.
I don't think that's there yet with Cypress.
Do you ever run into issues using Cypress of Click maybe not behaving as you would expect normally? Like, does the way that Cypress sends events to your app, does that mirror an actual user using the app?
For the times I've used it, and I've only used it for a couple of months because I got turned on to it recently, and I've written it. I probably used it in 7 or 8 apps. I haven't had any of those problems yet. No.
Okay.
But I'll look out for them. We should also, at some point, I wish Ward Bell would come on as well, because he's had a lot of experience at Test Café, and he talks very highly of that. Makes me want to try it to see what they're doing.
I haven't heard of Test Café at all, actually. I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Maybe we'll see if we can get an episode on that too.
So I wanted to ask about the book specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Is it available online, and where can people get it?
Oh, yeah, it's on Manning.com, available wherever books are sold, as they say. So on like Amazon, I think we have a few codes to give away. Okay. I don't know how that works.
Yeah, they sent us some codes, and I'm working on a way to randomly give them away.
Okay, great.
So we'll probably have a page up for that soon, and we'll announce it on the show.
And yeah, so it's available on like Amazon or on Manning.com, testing Angular applications. And they also, for all their books, they have ebook versions.
Okay, very nice.
One thing that I'm curious about here with this too is that, you know, we've listed like 4 or 5 tools that, you know, fit into different niches, lots of overlap between them. Do you worry that your book will become out of date? Or, I mean, if I have a dead tree version, it's not going to update itself. But sometimes you get updates on the ebooks.
That's true. Although I don't know with Manning's process of like what their process is for doing like a new version of the ebook. Okay. But that's definitely something I've been worried about. Like, especially as we've taken longer to edit it, and as we've been working on stuff in Protractor, and we tried to be aggressive about when we were writing it, about being forward looking, looking at stuff that's coming down the line. To give you an example of that, so in Selenium, every time you send a command to a browser, it's actually an async request, right? It's a network request that is going to an HTTP end that is telling the browser to do something. Because async programming was and still is, but because async programming was so difficult many years ago, before promises, before async await, before all of that, they came up with this managed promise idea. And the idea with managed promises was that you would write your test as if it's synchronous. And then at the end, so you say like, click, get this element, click on this thing. It's all synchronous code. And then at the end, there's a magic async code that runs the entire command. It's called the control flow. It runs all the async actions. And this was one of Protractor's biggest sort of value adds, was that it made dealing with the control flow easier for users. But with the advent of async await, Selenium decided to deprecate that system 2 years ago and instead say, hey, we're not going to do this managed promise thing because it makes it really hard to debug, because you set a breakpoint where you're sending a command actually hasn't been set yet, so you can't actually debug your test. We're going to instead explicitly make this an async API and explicitly say you have to await every promise that sends a command to the browser. So that came out while we were writing the book, right? That this API that used to be synchronous is now going to become asynchronous, and it's going to have all these changes as a part of it. And it's going to mean you can debug your tests more easily, but it's also going to mean we have a lot of things to explain to people now, and they have to go back and fix your tests. And so we try to be very forward-looking with that and include that content early and explain to people like, hey, what is control flow? You might be hearing about this thing being deprecated. Why does it matter to you? If you have Protractor tests, how do I make them work with the new version of Selenium? And so we were able to include that in the book, which is good that it came out now, because the next version of Selenium 4 removes the control flow. And so people will need to update to this new API. And we were able to get, in a very timely manner, instructions on how to do that and explanation for what's going on. And I'm just glad the book came out before Selenium 4 did. But yeah, absolutely. Going forward, I think when it comes to, as someone who works on frameworks or tools, if I want to communicate changing things, it's more effective to maybe do that via blog posts or via podcasts or via conference presentations, because books do have a delay to them. It is a very, non-agile process, I think, to get published.
I'm also wondering, and this comes out of the episode we did on JavaScript Jabber, we were actually talking about testing the front end. And the approach that our guest took was, and that was Josh Justice, who was our guest. But anyway, he works for Big Nerd Ranch. He was doing some testing where he was actually testing components with something like Cypress. And I'm wondering at what point, and I'm curious where everybody's at with this, at what point do you have this breaking point where you go, you know what, this isn't a good fit for Cypress or Selenium WebDriver or Test Café or something, and it's a better fit for something like Jest or Mocha or something like that? Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers, or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today.
Does anyone have any specific experiences or that of switching test frameworks, or why you decided to switch?
Well, no, for me, it's more like if I'm writing a component, I can load it up in the browser or the fake browser or whatever, for Cypress or something, and I can run tests against it. I click it does this. I did blah, 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 right? But then you also have other parts that either aren't UI, or there are certain types of components that are less functional, they're less clickable, interactable. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, do you take those and kind of throw Jest at them instead?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's the trade-off as you sort of move down the ladder from like WebDriver to Cypress to Karma and tests that involve, or Karma or Jest, or tests that involve Angular's renderer, to just maybe totally isolated JavaScript-only unit tests. Is the threshold there for moving Cypress to one layer down would be, do I need to, there's a distinction between white box testing and black box testing, right? So black box testing is, this is a black box, I don't know how it works. All I do is I push buttons and stuff changes. And then white box testing is more, I know internally how this is implemented, and I know that I need to make a call to a service here, mm-hmm. or send this kind of event, or do this kind of other thing to create the state that I need. And I don't have much experience in Cypress, actually. So that's a good question, is in Cypress, if you need to have a service do something, or if you want to trigger some sort of action that isn't triggerable through the UI, how do you do it, and how difficult is that to do?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm thinking about it. So you're saying if you want to trigger an action that's not triggerable in the UI?
Yeah. So let's say that part of my page has some sort of event that can fire and show like a free trial banner. or some sort of special banner that, when this API call comes in, then this needs to show up on the page. How do I do that in Cypress? How do I do things that don't involve just interacting with the page?
You can make XHR calls from Cypress, but if you talk about I want to trigger a JavaScript, I want to access a piece of JavaScript code.
Right.
Yeah, I don't.
Or maybe an interaction from, say, NGRX or something, right? Where, you have some data change and you want to test the data flow, but you don't necessarily need to test the UI for it.
Well, generally one of those things, you can access code, but generally one of those things, I've had this in apps where some kind of notification comes in, but usually something in a workflow will cause this to happen. So usually I end up falling back to some kind of UI thing. It becomes a long series of UI interactions. Sometimes those interactions become 20 steps, to be very fair, which can be painful. It's almost like doing Tetris, right? Make sure the thing lines up, drop it in quick. Oh, damn, I missed it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But that's usually been my experience. I've never really had to directly go call something in any of them, actually. So I'm not the best one to answer that.
Yeah, I guess
maybe it's a non-problem.
It's kind of a weird mix of a unit test. A unit test, you're just calling the code, right?
Yeah.
And then sort of an end-to-end or integration type test is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, and I think the point is it's okay to have integration tests that are running in Jest or Karma that are using Angular's test bed that are pulling together entire sections of your page, maybe even an entire route, if it's easier for you rather than getting there via the UI it depends on what you're trying to test, right? But if you're trying to test NGRX, I think is a good example.
Yeah, I guess my question then is, when does it get to the point where it's a unit test of that kind, where it makes way more sense to use Jest as opposed to doing some kind of end-to-end stuff?
I think it partially depends on the scale of your project, right? So GCP is a very big project, and we rely more on integration tests that run within Karma that mock out more services and mock out more of the framework, because that's a team of 4 people working on that. And so they have a contract that they need to worry about, and it fits into a much bigger chunk of a whole application.
Yeah, I think I can see my way to that. So do you folks use a test coverage tool like Istanbul? Or are you more on the side of, hey, look, everything should run, and if we find a bug that's untested, we just make sure we cover it?
We do have internal test coverage tools. We have tools that tell us what the incremental coverage is. Does this change cause us to have more or less coverage? But I think in general, our test coverage is driven more from bugs and more from developers saying just trying to test as much as they can. And sort of being reactive. It's hard because coverage isn't the full story, right? You can have total test coverage and not actually be, just because you're covering your code doesn't mean you're covering all the possible states you can enter into, or all the possible runtime conditions you can run into. Yeah, it depends on, again, how much traffic you get, whether you can rely on kind of your user base to surface things to you that you can then turn into regression tests.
So I want to circle back around to something you said really early. You said you weren't a fan of the testing pyramid, right?
Yeah.
And so can you explain a little bit more? I would say my understanding of the testing pyramid, I have my own understanding. So what is it about the testing pyramid that you are not a fan of?
Well, I just think it ends up being really prescriptive, and people end up in kind of naming arguments of well, is this an integration test, or is this a unit test, or is people get very caught up on what category of test is this, and trying to figure out where it fits into that USDA food pyramid of what's my daily recommendation of unit tests versus integration versus whatever tests. And I think it's not a very helpful abstraction. The way I think about it is tests exist on a spectrum, right? A spectrum that goes all the way from covering one tiny method to covering your entire app, or a spectrum that covers being completely isolated and hermetic to calling into production. And that it's more useful to think in terms of pragmatically, not do I have too many unit tests or do I have too many integration tests, but is my test suite slow? Does my test suite run quickly? Does it, flake out? Does it periodically fail for no reason? And when my test suite does fail, how quickly can I debug that problem? And I think those are the more important concerns, just the pragmatic effects of how your test suite affects your development. And I feel the test pyramid, as typically described, is kind of an oversimplification. And it drives people to create a lot of maybe low value unit tests. I think you don't necessarily need unit tests to verify that your thing instantiates or that your class can be instantiated, when you can just have like a single Cypress test that verifies your app works. That's giving you more value, and that you're better off having more unit tests for the part of your code that's trickier or there's more complicated logic, where you have more kind of potential cases to investigate.
Right. So what would you define as a slow test suite versus a fast test suite then?
It depends on your experience, but like ideally a test suite is valuable to you if you can run it with every change, right? The point of having tests is to be able to come in and confidently be able to change your code. So if I can come in and refactor something, like have it do the same thing, but just change how the code is organized, then how quickly do I get that feedback from my test suite that I haven't broken anything? And I'd say the limit on that is probably around 20 minutes. Faster is always better. If your test suite runs in like less than a minute, that's awesome. If it takes longer than 20 minutes, if it takes like an hour, that's probably too long.
I don't understand. How could you work with it being 20 minutes long if you're like, I literally can't compute that.
Yeah, the 20-minute test suite for me is, oh, sorry, I was on Twitter.
Right.
Right, when it finishes.
Right.
Well, because you're talking about being able to run it every time you have a change, but that there's no way 20 minutes equals that, right? Or are we talking about like really large changes and not
really large? Not like every time you change a letter, but like every time you put together like a PR or something, or like a commit, a full-on commit. Yeah, you should be able to run your entire test suite in a reasonable amount of time. 20 minutes is like, that does happen. Like people do live like that, and that's why I put out there as kind of like the extreme limit.
I was just imagining like working on the UI and like every time I made a change to the UI, waiting that and that.
Right. No, that's
like,
not. Yeah, that's.
I'm just going to go offline, right? Like forget everything.
Right.
Yeah, I'm typically using a test runner that will run just the relevant tests for the parts of the code I changed. Right. And that's usually based on what file it's in. And those will return fast. And then I'm not off on Twitter, looking up tweets about Donald Trump or something.
Right.
Oh, gosh. I don't know. Is there much Twitter activity about Donald Trump?
I haven't heard of it. I haven't heard anything.
I don't think so. I think that was pretty...
It'd be worse if the guy used Twitter.
Oh, golly.
Yeah, I don't think he does. I don't think he uses it.
I just discovered a really cool feature for test suites. If they're going to take longer than a certain amount of time, you put a threshold on those. It automatically suggests different Twitter feeds that you should be checking out.
Oh, dear Lord.
Oh, that's a great feature.
I would never get anything done.
Great as in horrible.
It could just like stick in tweets in the results so you don't get distracted.
Oh.
Yeah, that may be the worst productivity idea ever right there.
Yeah, like 10 out of 20. Like, here's a new tweet.
Oh.
Of course, I am going to tie into a product, I'm going to create a productivity tool now that recommends like Pluralsight courses or something. You're partially done with this one. Go finish it.
Yeah, or we noticed your testing sucks. Go take this one.
Yeah, very cool. So do you have different recommendations? We've talked a lot about like end-to-end testing and sort of the component integration testing. Do you have recommendations for the unit testing part of things? Keep them small, keep them focused, maybe not so much. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say keep them small and focused, definitely. And don't obsess about exhaustive unit tests. Like think about what question this test is asking and what you're going to do if it fails. And, if it's don't write trivial unit tests. Don't write tests that just like can't fail or won't fail unless some other test would have caught them, right? Just make sure your tests are giving you value. Also, it's really helpful just to make sure a test can fail, especially when you're doing async programming. Just as you're writing a test, if you're writing tests and your tests all pass, don't just trust that. Like try to introduce a bug and verify that the test you wrote will actually fail and will actually catch something.
Smart.
Yeah, especially that happens in async programming because it's really common to not have your test wait for a particular result to come in, right? And just sort of pass. Like the default behavior for a test is to pass. So it's helpful to make sure that your expectation was hit and that expectation actually captures something valuable.
Well, I don't know what else to jump on. You did mention that the GCP app is a big Angular app. So do you typically run the code or write your tests in TypeScript? And does it all get compiled by the TypeScript compiler? Or are you doing things more in JavaScript on that end? Or how does that all work?
So JavaScript is an officially supported language at Google. It is the only language to have gone through the like officially supported language process as of a year ago. So, like 10 years ago, they came up with a policy of this is what needs to happen for language to be accepted at Google. We already accept Java, Python, C++, and JavaScript because we have to. And they defined a policy of steps you could do to get a new language approved. And TypeScript is the only language to have successfully gone through that process.
Oh, I think you said JavaScript was. Okay, so
yeah, TypeScript was. Yeah.
So you can use TypeScript, is what you're saying.
Right.
Okay.
So we actually just finished a process of all of our tests were in JavaScript 5 months ago. And in the third quarter, from August to October, we converted all of our 1,600 integration tests from JavaScript to TypeScript. And at the same time, changed that API I was talking about from synchronous to async. So got off the control flow, made everything asynchronous.
How many people working on that?
So there's a couple hundred people working on GCP as a whole. For us, for our team, it was sort of 2 or 3 framework engineers who developed the migration tooling. And in the end, there were about 20 people who ran our tooling and migrated all their tests and made sure they all work.
Okay. Wow.
But yeah, we started with 1,500 JavaScript Protractor tests in August. And as of October 1st, we had 0 JavaScript Protractor tests.
How long does it take to run 1,500 Protractor tests?
Oh, yeah. That's a good
about 20 minutes, actually.
Oh, I love it.
If you've seen some of the new stuff from GCP about Cloud Build, we use a similar system internally to run our tests distributed over several machines in parallel. So ideally, all of the 1,600 tests take as long to run as the slowest one of those tests. Realistically, it depending on load and depending on time of day, it can take up to an hour or maybe an hour or 2. But generally, we shoot for 30 to 20 minutes to run the full test suite.
Wow.
And we've really enjoyed being on TypeScript for both just the editing experience of just having good code completion, of not worrying about typos, being able to catch things sooner. Also, this migration that we did where we took a synchronous API and made it async, it was made possible by TypeScript because we were able to create a compiler check in the TypeScript compiler that if you have something that returns a promise, that you do something with that promise. Usually that you await it, but that you at least pass into some other function or something, because otherwise you're making async calls and stuff happens out of order, and getting off the control flow would not have been possible for us without TypeScript. There was actually one more thing I wanted to talk about, just kind of in the general aim of end-to-end testing. So as I mentioned, we're GCP. We have a couple hundred developers. We have some in Warsaw, some in New York, some in Seattle. And our typical dogma for telling people how to write end-to-end tests was that you create page objects. So you create this object that has the selectors that knows how to find the components of your app. And what the Warsaw team found was that was too much friction for them. That was too much overhead, that they would have to create this object hierarchy to describe their pages. And then every time they made a new feature, they would have to go back and refactor it and change the selectors. So they hacked together the system of finding elements by text. So rather than having to go into like DevTools and look up the selector for this button or this checkbox, you would just say, look for a button with this text. And maybe you have that text several times on your page. So you would get positional based selectors to help narrow it down. So you would say, under name, look for a button that says add, right? Because maybe you have 3 add buttons on your page and that distinguishes between them. And what this turned into was a very simple API for writing tests. You would say, I expect to see this text. I'm going to click on something that has this text in it. I'm going to click on something else. You still have to use CSS selectors, but you spend a lot less time as you're writing integration tests looking up CSS selectors because you're able to just use what you see in front of you on the page. We initially were kind of horrified that they were doing this from a maintenance perspective, but after talking with them and seeing the kind of value it gave them, they really won us over. So Craig and I that was our talk at NGConf this year, was about a few things in Protractor. One was the control flow, and one was this new approach we call action helpers, which is a library for writing integration tests that doesn't depend on selectors. It depends on the text that you see when you look at the page. And we were able to write a Protractor test on stage for a feature, just do it live. And it was a really great experience because we had TypeScript, we had, without the WebDriver control flow, we had debugging via Chrome DevTools. And then we had this easy API that made it very easy to quickly express.
That's awesome. We should link to that talk in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll get a link in the show notes. Oh, there it is right there. Okay, I'll put the link in the show notes. All right, let's do picks.
Okay.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Alyssa, do you want to start us off with picks?
Well, sure. Last night, I went to a special, ahead of time opening of Fantastic Beasts, and it was really, really good. So it comes out this Friday. I know it'll be probably in the past, having already came out once this airs, but definitely suggesting it was a really fantastic movie. Okay, but yeah, that is my only pick.
Yeah, my kids are excited to see that one. So, Joe, what are your picks?
All right, so I want to pick the new Brandon Sanderson book. Just came out. I love Brandon Sanderson and love all the stuff. So
What's the new
I'm
book?
super excited to. It's called Skyward, which is really funny because it's also the same name as the software that runs my kids' schools that keeps their grades in it. Don't know if there's much purpose to the synergy. But anyway, so that, and I've also been reading Dungeons and Dragons novel called War of the Spider Queen that's been really interesting as well. So a couple of book picks there. And been playing a board game called Luxor that is amazing. By the time this comes out, it should be available for purchase. We had to pick it up in Denmark because it hasn't been released yet in the US.
How do you spell it?
Luxor. And it's basically your Indiana Jones going through a temple, raiding it for artifacts. And it's a really fun game just because there is luck and strategy involved. But the luck hides a lot behind stuff, so you don't feel like, oh, I can't win or lose. It's just, luck. Yeah, you don't have to be super strategic to really feel like you could be competitive. So I'm generally a more strategic thinker than my wife is, and she's won 2 of the 3 games that we have played. So, yeah, it's a pretty cool game. Really like it. And then finally, since we're talking about testing, I did a talk on Cypress at Angular Connect recently, just about a week ago. Of course, by the time this comes out, it'll be quite a little bit longer than that. But since we're talking about testing, might be a good thing. Go check it out. And I show a fair amount about how to use Cypress, sort of a demo of how to use Cypress. And a little bit of warning, I do show Protractor in some unfavorable light, and some of the stuff that I show you can actually work around in Protractor pretty easily. But I was kind of
you're making a case.
Yeah, I was making a case. So this is how most people work with Protractor, is to be very slow and poor, and with something like Cypress where you can quickly just look at what it is that's wrong. I wanted to show that off. So anyway, I really had fun. I did the talk only because I really wanted to learn Cypress. So that's why I volunteered to even give the talk, was because I really wanted to learn Cypress. So, which I did. It was really fun.
That's the best way to learn something, is to do a talk on it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. So there we go. Those are my picks.
Awesome. I'm going to jump in here with a few picks. I'm going to plug the show again, the devrev.com. I've got a few other things coming down the pipe. Some webinars and more content, and I'm going to start putting out some paid content. So keep your eye out for that.
And then I think I'm also going to be starting out remote conferences again next year. So keep an eye out for that as well. I've been listening a lot lately to the Gary V audio experience, which is Gary Vaynerchuk's podcast. And I've really been enjoying it. I kind of started at the beginning and downloaded all of the episodes, which filled up the storage on my phone and crashed it. But it's all better now. I've listened to enough of them to where I have like a gig of space on my 64 gig phone. Anyway, really enjoying that. And then
how many hours of audio is 64 gigs? Just curious, like if the internet died and you lived for 40 years before you died, like wasteland zombies, and so there would be no opportunity. Is that the scenario that you were going for? Is what if I better have all this audio here for 40 years worth? Is that kind of how that played out?
Yeah, pretty much. I have to have all of it.
It's like possible to just download the stuff, like the next 6 or 8 episodes, listen to those, and then get the others.
Shut up, Joe.
That's a thing.
Shut up, Joe.
I love that. I was just assuming he was going through that much content. I was like, rocket, man.
Yeah. So 1 gig, it depends on the compression rate on the MP3s. It's a few hours, I think.
Like, is the audio only in like wave format or?
All right. Anyway, I'm getting off. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah. So I've been enjoying the podcasts, and I got Skyward on my wish list in Audible. So when I get some credits, I'll probably buy it. We got everyone's picks except Mike's. Mike, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah. So I've been reading Scale by Geoffrey West. So Geoffrey West is a physicist who decided to work in biology, which is typically it's not a story that goes well. It's like the physicist tries to reduce everything to physics, but it's a really interesting book. He explores a lot of interesting questions about how do biological systems change as they scale, and what relates, say, the lifespan or the metabolism as an organism. So, like, how do all mammals relate to each other as they scale from a mouse to a whale, and how does the whale's lifespan vary with its body size compared to, say, a mouse?
Interesting.
Really interesting. And then he takes that idea and applies it to other complex systems, including cities and companies. It's a really interesting read. And for board games, I like Captain Sonar. I don't know how many people are familiar with it.
That's a fun game.
Yeah, it's a
good game.
Real-time cooperative / competitive board game. I don't think there's anything else quite like it.
Yeah, that's the one where different people
Space Cadets Dice Duels is very similar.
Oh, yeah.
Try and sync the other sub, right?
Yeah, you're like on 2 teams.
Yeah.
So you got your 4 people versus other 4 people. And you're trying to communicate with your team and also try not to be too loud so that the other team hears you. And you're like running the sub, like searching for each other. Yeah.
What was the name of that other game, Joe?
Space Cadets Dice Duels. It's a little older than Captain Sonar, but it's kind of the same concept, except, say, Star Trek, instead of submarines. You're on a ship, and you can have up to 4 people, and each person has a different job. So one person decides where you go, one person fires the weapons, one person handles the engineering. I can't remember the 4th role. And you can play with fewer than 4 people per team, but it plays best with 4 people on each team. And that's a really fun one, but very similar to Captain Sonar.
That sounds cool.
And then I just saw in Denmark while I was there a new board game of Sonar Family, which plays with just 4 people, 2 on each team, which I think you can play Captain Sonar with just 2 on each team, but this one maxes out at 4 people, 2 on each team. So,
yeah, I've played Captain Sonar with 8 and with 6, and somebody has to double up.
Yeah.
And then it gets real interesting.
Yeah.
I think this one was more specifically for like playing with your kids, so it wasn't as hard.
Right. Sounds good. Well, Mike, if people want to find you online, is there a place where you blog or tweet or put your code?
There isn't. I'm on Twitter at Heathkit, HEATHKIT. And I'm also that on GitHub and pretty much every other social platform.
Good deal. Well, thanks again for coming. We'll go ahead and wrap this one up, and we will catch everybody next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.